So our next speaker is Effie Håland, who's a Norwegian government grant holder, but emerita now, I think since May last year. So she did a lot of field work since the 80s in the Mediterranean, mainly Greece and Italy, and working on Greek festivals and rituals, and producing a few years ago kind of a monumental work on the topic. And she's particularly interested in gendered religious practice in both ancient and modern Greece. And today she will talk about water sources and the sacred in modern and ancient Greece. Thank you.
Thank you. In Greece, springs and caves have traditionally shaped religious beliefs and practices. The power of the place is illustrated by a sacred center offering a direct contact with the divine, then relocating that center in a human body, making the divine even more accessible and responsive to human beliefs and aspirations. In this connection, springs and caves are particularly important, and in ancient times, springs represented water nymphs. Today, springs are dedicated to the Panagia, the Virgin Mary, under her attribute of the life-giving spring. Ancient and modern believers have expressed their beliefs in rituals connected to purity and water by fetching holy water from the caves dedicated to these female divinities. In the way earlier cult places, natural phenomena are adapted to the Orthodox religion through the importance of the cave shrines can be seen as emanating directly from the matrix of an animate landscape. Panagia's Athenian chapel is situated inside a circular spring house hewn in the rock on the southern slope of the Acropolis. So let's go over to a case study where the first part deals with the cleaning of this Acropolis cave. On Saturday, the 4th of April 1992, Irene carries out the monthly cleaning of the cave church. In the morning, I arrived together with my visiting mother and Irene's daughter Maria to the cave church called the Life-Giving Spring due to the sacred spring. Irene tells that it is dedicated to Ayanadjidi, the patron saint of healing. Irene has been cleaning the cave regularly since her deceased husband was working at the Acropolis. Today, 2 other women also arrived and a young man, Panayotis. When I reached the cave this morning, everyone washes in the spring and drinks the water. The 2 women assert that the water is miracle working and healing. They also state that since childhood, they have been brought to the life-giving spring to fetch holy water along with their mothers. It has always been like this. The first declaration is a clear instance of how Greek children are socialized. The comment about how it always has been is a general remark that most informants give when a researcher asks how old a custom is. They explain that among the many icons in the cave, the most holy represents the Panagia and child. In front of this icon, one of the women arranges a bunch of flowers. So even if we have just learned that the cave still is dedicated to Ayanadjidi, the Panagia is the one who gets the gifts. Furthermore, the icons of the Panagia are mainly dedicated to metal plaques depicting a vow or request votive offerings taumata, even if the icon of Ayanadjidi still is in the cave. The most common offering is a silver or gold-plated ex voto representing the person who has been miraculously cured by the icon in combination with the water or the cured limb itself or the personal limb wanting to be cured. People claim to be cured for allergies, eczema, and arthritis, illnesses that doctors could not diagnose, eye ailments, nervous problems, and also pregnancies to the spring water. Or in the words of one of my informants, the sacred water cures all illnesses from the stomach up, including the head. The faithful light candles in front of the icon and the lighted olive oil lamps. They fill water in bottles while saying that even if it is not raining, there will always be water in the cave. The cave is situated within the archaeological quarter and generally the entrance is locked up with bars and padlocks. Therefore, it was necessary to obtain a special permission from the representatives of the Ministry of Culture to do research in the cave, a task which was not easy. Even if the representatives for the authorities were very helpful, it took some time before they understood my request. Several found it quite incomprehensible that I was not interested in only talking with the archaeologists who work at the site, but also with a woman who regularly cleans the cave and people who have been used to fetch water there since childhood. That I was as interested in establishing contact with living people practicing their religion in the same cave where the water nymphs once were worshipped, as in the archaeological ruins, which are mute compared to the traditional cult practice in the cave, was incomprehensible. While Irene lights candles and fetches water in the cave, we chat about the annual festival dedicated to the life-giving spring, which will take place here in a month's time. However, it is not yet decided if the festival will be celebrated this year due to two practical problems, one of them being the actual date of the festival in 1992. Another problem is the relationship with the new parish priest and the celebrants. According to Maria, the old priest in the Byzantine church of Myszkowska-Ryciak on Plaka always was officiating during the festival, but now he's very old, and his successor is participating at the festival, claiming that it represents a pagan custom. In 1991, he said that he was ill, even if there is a close relationship between the official Orthodox religion and popular religion. This situation still is a general problem we also see during other Greek festivals. In 1991, the festival finally was successfully celebrated because they invited a priest from the University of Piraeus to officiate at the ceremony. However, they still do not know what will happen this year, so let's go over to part 2 and see what happened. In Greece, the first week after the resurrection of Christ on Easter Sunday is known as the White Week. On New Friday, in the White Week, they feast the Virgin Mary under her attribute of Zodochos Pigi, the life-giving spring. She acquired this epithet in the 9th century in a hymn to the Mother of God. In Athens, the festival is celebrated in a special way since the church dedicated to the life-giving spring is situated inside the archaeological site of the Acropolis. In 1992, Friday after Easter coincided with the 1st of May, or Workers' Day. This is a general holiday also for the guards working at the Acropolis area. In this connection, this is important because of the location of the cave. In March, the guards told me that the Acropolis area would be closed for visitors on the 1st of May. It seemed that the Curator of Antiquities of the Acropolis found it difficult to decide whether the festival would be celebrated and people would be permitted to come into the area and fetch holy water. So how will it turn out? Will the ideology related to the holiday of the workers, as it is adopted to the Greek nation-state, submit to the traditional popular custom, or will the new ideology related to Western Europe be the winner? Both festivals represent the people, but one is related to a nationalist ideology confirmed with a Western ideology, while the other represents the inward-facing identity, the Romaic image of Greece that echoes the Byzantine Empire and hence the Orthodox Christian tradition to which the majority of Greeks still adhere. Finally, the Acropolis authorities decided to keep the area open and the popular religiosity triumphed. The festival is celebrated from 8:30 until 11. The guards are on duty at the entrances to the Acropolis. Here the Greeks from the neighborhood are separated from the rest of the people outside the gates. Only Greeks are admitted since it is their festival. The Romaic tradition gains the victory over the Hellenic. The Romaic identity is not placed at foreigners' disposal as the Greeks do with the common ancient heritage, which is outward directed. So one may claim that the ideology of the workers became subjugated by the traditional religious custom, which is connected with deep-seated values. People's need to fetch life-giving water from the spring on this specific festival, when the water is thought to be particularly healing and purifying. However, the faithful did not only have to compete with the political ideology, but also the religious, since the parish priest denied officiating. Accordingly, he had to be replaced by another. During the celebration, many people are present. The officiating priest is the same as the year before. Outside the entrance to the cave church, several tables are set up. They are laid with a variety of breads and cakes brought by the participants, particularly their own holy bread, prosphoro, which always is offered to the church and blessed by the priest. Inside the church, several candles are lit at the altar in front of the wall behind which is the spring the priest is officiating. When he concludes the Mass, he starts to assemble the rest of the holy bread which he has distributed to the participants. He also packs up his briefcase, which is situated in the middle of the altar. But people are still flowing into the cave to fetch water, although most of the participants flow downhill from the cave, carrying small bottles with holy water, holy bread, and pieces of cakes as soon as the service is finished. An old priest leaves, carrying with him a bottle with holy water for the following year. People who flow into the church are not only fetching holy water, they also wash in the spring and drinks from the water. The water scoop is repeatedly used during the festival. A man walking on crutches sits next to the spring, occupied with drawing water. Supplied with a water scoop, he continually receives empty bottles, which he fills and returns to people who are queuing up to obtain holy water. Other people sprinkle their heads. In the middle of the ground floor, a basket filled with pieces of bread is placed on the ancient column, the former holy table. When the last slice of bread is taken, a faithful seizes the basket and pours the rest of the crumbs over him. While people are occupied with their own water fetching ritual, the guards working at the Acropolis become more and more impatient. They're shouting that we ought to get out. But people don't bother at all. They continue to fetch water and bread. They drink, eat, kiss the various icons, and make the sign of the cross. Irene becomes angry and argues ardently with the head of the guards. At 11 o'clock, we are more or less thrown out, but the Acropolis authorities had to open up the church and let people in and keep several guards on duty for more than 3 hours on the 1st of May 1992. The situation 20 years later was very different. On Friday, the 20th of April 2012, the celebration took place from 9 to 11. The young priest in the Byzantine church of Ios Nikolaos and Plaga is officiating. Many people arrive and don't know how to enter because of the signs telling danger, no entrance to the archaeological area. Outside the cave church, a flower-decorated icon rests on a stand. People line up to enter. They hold lighted candles inside by the altar in front of the wall behind which is the spring the priest is officiating. Many of the icons and other holy symbols that I saw in 1992 and in 2006 have been removed, and the cave seems more cold, but it is constantly dripping from the roof. By the end of the liturgy, all receives communion. A man comes in with prayer papers to be read by the priest, and the priest and the church warden go outside and purifies, blesses the entire area. While the priest is outside blessing, some women start to fetch water, although they are told to do that after the liturgy has finished. Also in 2019, the ritual was celebrated, but although the liturgy has always been celebrated inside the cave, this year it was outside due to falling rocks and landslide risks. However, many people are present. Several also managed to get into the cave and fetch water, although they were told to wait outside and let the organizers supply them with water from the sacred spring. In ancient Greece, in most grottos, a cave full of water was thought to be manifestations of the divinity. Later, most of the caves have been transformed into churches, such as in Athens, where the Panagia has taken over the healing power of the ancient water nymphs. As parallels to the ancient votive offerings dedicated to the nymphs, today we find many icons with ex-votos attached to them. So the Athenian chapel is situated on a site already sacred to water divinities in antiquity. The spring and its surroundings were initially sacred to the water nymphs. The spring house built over it originally dates to the late 6th century BCE. That the area was sacred to the nymphs is shown by an abundance of votive reliefs with nymphs found in this area. Other gods were also worshipped there from the 5th century BC onward. So the original cult of the spring, followed by the spring house, Later situated within the Asclepieion or Sanctuary of Asclepius, are much older than the Shrine of Asclepius, which was dedicated in 419 BCE. Then the sacred territory of the spring became officially marked off by a marble boundary stone. Asclepius owes his status and popularity to the healing of sickness. His daughter, who simply is named Ea, health, also illustrates the healing aspect. News of miracle cures drew hordes of visitors to Epidaros, the original cult center of Asclepius, and gave rise to a regular health business. Nevertheless, at the time of the Great Plague of 429 BCE, the god went to Athens. The cure followed a ritual during which patients washed in a sacred spring, offered at an altar, and then retired to the stoa, where the mysterious process of incubation was assisted by incense from the altars. This produced dreams through the medium of which Asclepius was supposed to effect his cure. Many ex-voto tablets to Asclepius and Ea have been found showing the portion of the anatomy treated. Pausanias, living in the 2nd century CE, tells about voti offerings he saw when visiting the cave, specifying, "Inside there is a spring by which they say that Poseidon sun deflowered Alcippe, a common practice in antiquity." Around the 5th century CE, all the buildings were demolished, and on the foundations, a large Christian basilica was built to the memory of the doctor saints. So the sanctuary dedicated to the ancient god of healing was transformed into a Byzantine church. Here, under the patronage of Ius Cosmas and Ius Damianos, the process of incubation, assisted by incense, along with the miracle-working nature of the sacred spring, continued under the Christian aegis, as seen in the drawing from the 1750s. When the area around the Asclepieion was excavated in 1876, the cave with holy water also became dedicated to the Panagia. So the cult of the cave dedicated to a female divinity and a cure in the spring is not necessarily representing cult continuity, but perhaps rather revival of, according to the Greek scholar Demetrios Loukatos, who examines the cult continuity from Asclepius to Aianariri, the cave is still dedicated to the doctor saints. But, as already specified today, the ex-votos are mainly dedicated to the Panagia, who in practical life seems to be the most important saint worshipped in the cave. A parallel to the cult in the Acropolis cave is found on the Aegean island of Tinos, the greatest shrine of Greek Orthodoxy. A particular account is connected with the shrine. In 1823, after several mystical visions of the nun named Pelagia, they found a miraculous icon of the Annunciation of the Panagia. According to tradition, Pelagia saw repeatedly in her visions the Panagia, who ordered her to start excavations in order to find her icon and to build her house, her church. The icon was unearthed in the field where it had remained since the church, built on the ruins of a pagan temple, was destroyed in the 10th century. 2 years before the icon was found, the Greek War of Liberation broke out. The finding of the icon, the construction of the church, the enormous crowds of pilgrims, and all the miracles contributed to the act that in 1971 the island was declared a sacred island by governmental decree. Pelagia also became sanctified. The sanctuary on Tinos also has a chapel dedicated to the life-giving spring, and rituals connected with water are important as in all Greek churches. The first excavations on Tinos brought to light the ruins of the foundations of the Byzantine church, first and foremost a deep but dry well. On the day of the laying of the cornerstone of the church, the formerly dry well became filled with water. The source is seen as a miracle, and the water is regarded as sacred. Accordingly, pilgrims take bottles of this precious water home. Today, it is also important to be baptized in water from one of the many sacred springs dedicated to the Panagia, and on Tinos, many children are baptized in water from the life-giving spring. Holy water, ayasma, is found in most modern Greek sanctuaries, but some sanctuaries offer particularly miracle-working water with its own legend attached to it, and several caves with springs which were dedicated to ancient gods and goddesses, particularly water nymphs, are now transformed into chapel dedicated to the Panagia. Rituals connected with water are central in modern and ancient Greece, such as the festival dedicated to the Panagea, the life-giving spring. In this connection, it is important to mention the establishment of the festival dedicated to the life-giving spring in Constantinople, modern Istanbul, by the Patriarch in 1833. Through the significant blessing of the ayasma, we meet holy water, or a very old purification symbol, which on one level is reinvented in the service of the national ideology by the actual establishment, the same year as the Greek struggle for independence came to a successful conclusion. This may be regarded as an example of ideological reuse of old popular symbols in the service of the nation-state. At intervals, this way of utilization has burst open throughout Greek history, simultaneously as people have on another level carried out their own rituals, for example by fetching miracle-working water in the same cave, despite ideological changes. Thank you.
Next speaker is Effie Jones.
Well, I would say the world leading expert on ancient minerals, clays in particular, but she's been working on medicinal minerals for many years at the University of Glasgow, but it's a teamwork. So we have George Christidis, who's another geologist who made a great contribution to clay mineral science. But we also have Charles Knapp, who's the microbiologist from the University of Strathclyde, I think, Glasgow. And we have also the wine chemist, who's Tina Kallithraka, who's professor of enology at the Agricultural University of Athens. And so today, Effie will talk about the green and the white and the yeast that binds them, Oxos, poor wine as a reagent in biotechnological processes in the 4th century BCE. Thank you, Effie.
Thank you very much. Well, ladies and gentlemen, let me thank the organizers first for inviting me to come here. And it's my first time in Poland. I've never been here before. I would like to see a bit more of her. I don't know if I'm going to get the chance, but thank you nevertheless. Today I will be speaking about not our usual fare in ancient pharmacology, the minerals and the plants, but about reagents. And one reagent in particular, Oxos, which has been translated as vinegar. So reagents are facilitators. They make a reaction take place. They're usually consumed in the course of the reaction. Some solvents can be reagents as well. The point is that they are very instrumental. And of course we have no evidence for them in the archaeological record. Oxos was a fundamental reagent in the production of pharmaca metallica. These are the minerals that derived from the mines, the coppers, the leads, the zinc oxides, the carbonates, sulfides, sulfates. And Oxos was not an inorganic reagent or a solvent. It had a biotic component in it. And we have to factor that in the way we think about Oxos. But what was Oxos exactly? Was it really vinegar? And most important, how do we go about finding out about it in the absence of archaeological evidence? Let me just say a few things. I'm sure all of you know about pharmaca metallica. This is Galen who coined a term. And within his group, he highlighted 3 subgroups. One is the Aphtophii pharmaca metallica, which are the naturals. They're the ones that are extracted from the mines. The Ekaminon, the ones that derive from the hearths and the furnaces, essentially high temperature processes, 800 and above, 600, high temperature in any case. And then we have the Skevazomena, the manufactured ones, which take place within the workshop and at ambient temperatures between 10, 15, 25 degrees. Amongst the Skevazomena, Galen highlights 4 or 5 of them. I will only be focusing on 2, the Psimithion and the Oxystos. The Psimithion is the white pigment and the Oxystos the blue-green one. We call them pigment because they have been manufactured not just throughout antiquity, very much until the 19th, early 20th century of our era. And we got to know them via art. But in actual fact, when you look at the texts of the 4th and 5th and 3rd century BCE, they did not appear in art. They appear in pharmacological preparations, and primarily for external applications, emplastra. Oxos is ubiquitous with Pharmaca metallica, the material itself. These Pharmaca metallica, the cadmia, the bonfolics, etc., are either mixed with Oxos, or made with Oxos, or rubbed with Oxos, or quenched with Oxos. They can't be without Oxos. That is the long and the short of it. And not only do we see them in the synthesis of the Pharmaca metallica, we see them in the preparation of the compound drug as well. And here I have Ianto Jock's excellent compilation of recipes of emplastra from Scribonius Largus, 2nd century CE, which he lists, and the recipes list the minerals, the botanicals, the waxes and resins, and the oxos and wines. So I have rearranged the text, but in actual fact, these 4 components are there. You see that only in one recipe water is used as the solvent in this case. So water doesn't seem to come into the equation. Milk doesn't seem to come into the equation. It's primarily oxos and wine. So let's focus into 2 of them, as I said. In everything we do, we have to fix ourselves and our minds on the period that we are looking at. And whatever materials we analyze, we have to say these are the materials from that period which fit the recipe of that period. So we are in the 4th century BC. Theophrastus writes his on stones. And his recipe, and I'm quoting from Calais and Richards, 1956, I will use the Greek words, molybdos or lead, about the size of a brick, is placed in jars, pithos, over oxos. And when this acquires a thick mass, which it generally does in about 10 days, then the jars are open and a kind of mold, evros, is scraped off the lead, and this is done again until all the lead is used up. The part that is scraped off is ground in a mortar and decanted frequently, and what is finally left at the bottom is psimithion. We have numerous examples of contemporary psimithia from female graves, literally down the street, from burials down the road of where Theophrastus would have been teaching. In, as I said, in small pyxides, small pellets, very standardized, not just in weight, in size, and as I will show, in composition as well. Before I get to this, the second is the Oxystos, and he gives us the recipe. Verdigris is the modern term, is made in much the same way. Red copper instead of lead is placed over grape residues, and the matter that collects on it, the copper, is scraped off. For it is verdigris that appears there. Now I'm very proud of my verdigris. It's actually hoganite. We did an X-ray diffraction on it. I certainly hope Vermeer would have liked it if he were to take some of it, but I have to say I won't give it to him as is. We got biofilms on it, we've got little bugs on it, so certainly he did quite a few things before he worked with his Ioxystos. I leave the Ioxystos and I will focus, because of lack of time, on the psimithion only. So I said these pellets that you see on the right hand here are very standardized, and compositionally, and this is research not just by us, it has been going on since the 1930s, essentially identified one phase or 2. The main phase is cerussite, that's lead carbonate, to almost 99%, 98%, 100%. The second phase being a basic lead carbonate or hydrocerussite. It's only in one example that the samples from Volos, where the ratios are inverted, the majority is hydrocerussite and cerussite is at the minority. Hydrocerussite is what the post-medieval period and since then has manufactured. So again, Every material has to be looked at its time. And we cannot equate lead carbonate with basic lead carbonate. They look the same, they appear the same, but they're not. So we know what the cerussite of the 4th and 3rd century BC was, compositionally speaking. And we have the recipe of how to make cerussite from lead and Oxos. We're not after understanding cerussite, we're after understanding Oxos. So our premise, our hypothesis in these experiments is that we would hopefully find out, we would know if we have the correct Oxos, if we manage to produce near 100% lead carbonate, just like those little pellets. So this was an assumption we made, and we decided to go along with it. Now we turn to our texts, and what do they say about Oxos? Well, Leader Scott, for me, is the guideline for everything in the ancient Greek world. So Oxos, which is neutral, most of us call it O-Oxos, but it isn't, it's To-Oxos. They identified it as poor wine or vin ordinaire. You can make vinegar from Oxos, but it is not Oxos. It may have been called Oxos because it is sour in taste, but the Greeks had a word for it, and it was called oxinis inos, for sour wine. More importantly, the Greeks had a name for vinegar. So if they wanted to say vinegar, they would have said targanon. And Leader Scott translates targanon as vin éventé, a wine that's allowed to aerate, and this is what you will get in any bottle of wine you get from your supermarket. If you leave it out, it will go to vinegar. Specialist in wines and vinegars, etc., so sat us down and says, all right, you have to know the difference between sour wine and poor wine. The definition of a sour wine is it specifically refers to a wine with an excessively acidic or vinegary taste, often due to spoilage or improper storage. On the other hand, poor wine can encompass a range of issues, like lack of complexity, unbalanced flavors, muted aromas, not necessarily limited to just a sour taste. A poor wine, and this is the critical thing, may also be too sweet, overly bitter, or flat. So a whole gamut opens up, which takes us out of this looking down along the oxinis inos, the sour wine aspect. We turn now to the great work of Andrew, the translation of the Geoponica, and they were given a whole lot of recipes how to make Oxos. So you can make Oxos with wine by putting a root of beet in the wine, and in 3 hours, presto, you got Oxos. That's book 8, etc. You can make Oxos without using wine. And what you get is peaches and roasted barley. You leave it for days, you strain and use. You can take figs and citrons and roasted barley. You stir vigorously, and when fermented, you strain and use. You can also make Oxos drymis. It's translated by Andrew as sour Oxos, but it has in other places as sharp vinegar or strong vinegar. How do you make the Oxos drymis, which is what I prefer to say? You make it by taking ordinary Oxos. You add roots of dog's tooth grass, raisins, bruised leaves of wild pear, bramble root, and whey. I'll come back to this later. What essentially those recipes, if looked overall, tell us is that you need a liquid that's undergoing alcoholic fermentation. And of course, once it's undergoing alcoholic fermentation, you've got microorganisms in it, whether you like it or not. And you need an extra source of sugars. And you need the Mediterranean temperature to get on with it. We knew that Oxos was not targanon, so it was not a vinegar. However, because we carry a tradition of at least 2,000 years, if not more, of thinking that Oxos was vinegar, We sort of put to the side Andrews and the Geoponicas' recommendations of how to make Oxos, and we said we're going to make it starting with wine. And what we assumed is that Oxos is a product that happens after ethanol production and before acidification. So a halfway product. And this is how we set up all our experiments, that it is on its way to being vinegar, but not really vinegar. So we set up on the island of Aegina. Tina brought in must from just harvested in September 23, and we put the must in plastic containers and allowed to ferment over 4 weeks or until the frothing stopped. At the end of the fermentation, we took half of the contents of the container and placed it in another container, and then together placed the lead plate that you see here, suspended it over the liquid. So we wanted to make sure that acidification, as per the end of the alcoholic fermentation and the beginning of acidification and simethion making started taking place at the same time. What we did, we let it allowed to go, and only on the basis of visual inspection, when we started getting this evros, this mold, on the surface of the lead, we took it out, we scraped it off, and took samples of both the mineral on the evros and of the liquid. In doing the X-ray diffraction analysis on the solids, we found that we got about 77% cerussite and about 23% hydrocerussite. Not good enough, but not bad for beginners. The majority cerussite and less hydrocerussite. But what happened in the Oxos, or what happened in the liquid that produced this mineral? So we had taken samples of the must and we analyzed it, DNA sequencing and qPCR on it, to know exactly which microorganisms, both as bacteria and yeasts and fungi, were in operation, because it was the microorganisms that drove the reaction. Theophrastus pot was essentially a bioreactor. The microbes got on to do what they knew how to do best. So it was a sealed vessel. We didn't interfere at all with it. Our starting liquid had a very small concentration of Acetobacter. This is acetic acid bacteria, which are responsible for converting ethanol to acetic acid. They're aerobes, they need oxygen. There was Enococcus, which was the majority of what was in the must at the start, but at the finish, we got half the concentration of them. The Enococcus are lactic acid bacteria and responsible for the second stage of fermentation, and they are anaerobes, they don't like oxygen. And there were the Saccharomyces, which are the yeasts, which they started at about 76% and they went up to 100%. So we knew that the amount of Saccharomyces got increased and the Acetobacter also increased. So we had both acetic acid formation, but also we had the increase in the Saccharomyces, which essentially what they do is they convert sugars to alcohol with the production of CO2. CO2 is what we want. If we're going to convert the metal to its carbonate, we better have a lot of CO2. So in comparing the original composition of the biotic liquid and that which generated the 77% cerussite, we noted that, as I said, Saccharomyces increases. So Saccharomyces were responsible for the generation of the CO2 necessary for the production of the carbonate phase. Okay, so far so good. Next experiment. A lot of those experiments were happening at the same time. I'm just presenting them sequentially. So we did exactly the same thing and took another container, and there we allowed the fermentation to go on. The fermentation finished, but we did not put the lead metal immediately into at the end in the container at the end of this fermentation, we allowed the acetification to start. So we wanted to see, what do we get? The answer is no good. Because when we analyzed the quantitative XRD, we found that we only got 6% of sericide and 75% of hydrosericide and a lot of lead acetates. Very disappointing indeed. Immediately we started looking, where is our Saccharomyces? What have they been doing? Well, nothing is the answer, because their concentration went down from 76% to 11%. Saccharomyces don't die, acetobacteria do not die unless you heat the sample, and then they do. They just go to sleep, they're not interested. They sit at the bottom of the container. In comparing the original composition, we, as I said, with the final, we found out that the acetobacteria increased, which means we had a lot more vinegar created in the solution. But we knew that if we have a lot of vinegar, we are not producing sericide. So it follows that our Oxos could not have been vinegar, acetic acid rich. I hope that makes sense. We knew at that stage that Oxos manufacture should not be part of a vinegar making process if we wish to make psimithion with Oxos. So it is very important to say what we wanted to make, and for our purposes. We then went back and looked at the composition, as I said, of this material that we made. And apart from the hydrosericide and the little sericide, we made a lot of acetates. Now, acetates, lead acetates, are water soluble. So we did exactly what Theophrastus suggested, and we scraped off the Evros, put it in water, and instantly the water turned milky white, and all the insoluble compound went to the bottom, and of course we increased the concentration in hydrosericide. So we knew that if we have a prevalence of acetic acid bacteria in our container, then we would be more likely to make the hydrosericide than the sericide. If we had our Saccharomyces, which pump out CO2, then we make sericide. The aim is to keep, therefore, the Saccharomyces happy and active. And how do we keep them happy and active? They need a source of sugar. Well, the Geoponica author could have told us, I told you so from the very beginning. You just did not listen to me. Because he said, you have a liquid that's undergoing fermentation and the microorganisms that go in it, but you need an extra source of sugars. And the reason you need an extra source of sugars, Effie, is because you need to keep your Saccharomyces pumping out CO2. We tried different experiments. We tried vinegar as per artisan vinegar. We got very little, just lead acetates, and it was like a soft paste on top of it. We didn't pursue it any further. About the Oxos Drymis, we are starting a whole set of experiments on that. I won't go in it, but essentially making vinegar from whey, which has been done, and there are papers and papers on it. What have we learned from there? Do we have a single recipe for Oxos? I don't know is the answer. I will go back to the Geoponica and say, yes, any of this, I know what the key things are, what are the key ingredients are in it, but all I can say is I know what Oxos do I need in order to make psimithion. I don't know what the culinary Oxos might have been. Maybe I will say what the medicinal Oxos is. But I do know, and that's as far as I will go, what Oxos I need to have to make lead carbonate, my 4th century psimithion. And I leave it at that. Thank you very much.
So we have Professor Kokoszko and Zofia, our wonderful host. So head of the Department of Byzantine History here in Łódź, and Zofia, he is assistant professor at the Waldemar Cerna Research Center for the History of Culture and Culture of the Mediterranean area and Southeast Europe. And of course, their area of interest is food and medicine, but also cosmetics and historiography, Byzantine historiography. But these are the historians. We have the scientists of nutrition as well, and they work together. So we have Professor Małgorzata Drywień, and we have Joanna Myszkowska-Ryciak, and they are both professor at the Institute of Human Nutrition Science, but they're particularly interested in children nutrition and obesity, eating disorder, interaction between nutrients, dietary supplements, and nutritional education as well.
Today, the outcome of a very straightforward idea, let's take something like ancient and Byzantine text, and let's take something like modern knowledge, and let's compare it. And this is basically it. So it is on a very limited subject. So this is on boiling milk in ancient and Byzantine medical texts versus modern nutritional science, some bits and pieces. So our presentation will focus on ancient and Byzantine technologies of boiling milk for therapeutic purposes. The primary sources for this study will be medical treatises from the respective periods. The information contained within this text will subsequently be compared with findings of modern nutritional science, allowing us to assess whether and to what extent the views held by ancient Ars Medica align with the current scientific understanding of the issue. The choice of topic is motivated by two main premises. First, milk of good quality was regarded as one of the most beneficial foodstuffs. Second, thermal processing of milk represented the only available method for prolonging its salutary action. Ancient and Byzantine dietitians were aware of the fact that milk, though seemingly uniform, is not a homogeneous substance. In the absence of chemical analysis, its composition was identified on the basis of milk physical characteristics. In consequence, dietitians adopted two main ways of approaching the problem. First, milk was described holistically, that is, as a homogeneous or uniform substance, and secondly, attention was given to its constituent parts, whey, curd, and fat, whose properties could be readily evaluated through organoleptic means. In De Simplicium Medicamentorum Temperamentis ac Facultatibus, Galen states that, for therapeutic purposes, milk must be entirely free of impurities. This means that it should not possess a bitter, sour, pungent, or salty taste, nor should it emit an unpleasant odor. Rather, it ought to have a pleasant aroma or otherwise no discernible smell at all, and should be generally palatable with a mildly sweet flavor. This description clearly indicates that both dietary and pharmacological practices require the use of fresh milk. This interpretation is further supported by another passage from the same treatise, in which Galen remarks that because milk undergoes rapid changes, its true properties are revealed only when it is as fresh as possible. This observation demonstrates a general awareness that ambient temperature had a detrimental effect on the shelf life of milk. The warm Mediterranean climate facilitated its natural transformation, which, according to the ancient Byzantine dietary theory, resulted in milk's acquisition of undesirable properties. To arrest the process, milk was subjected to thermal treatment.
Modern science asserts that the changes in the physical properties of milk are caused by the microorganisms and enzymes naturally present within. The rapid transformation observed in milk shortly after its being obtained results from the accelerated growth of microorganisms, of which over 700 species may be present. The microorganisms reproduce so rapidly owing to the high water content, comprising approximately 80 to 85% of its total volume, in milk and its abundance of high-quality nutrients. The process, of course, adversely affects milk quality during storage and its processing. In addition, various endogenous enzymes found in milk also contribute to undesirable alteration in its composition. The thermal treatment of raw milk, which inactivates both microorganisms and enzymes, remains the most widely used method for ensuring its safety and delaying spoilage. Although today additional technologies such as short-term sterilization, microfiltration, and ultrasonic treatment are also employed, heat processing continues to play a fundamental role in modern milk preservation.
In the analyzed by myself and Zofia text, we can find rather detailed descriptions of milk boiling, which may be interpreted as an indication of the significance of this process, of this procedure played in therapeutic practice. One method is described by Christidis, so the 1st century AD, when he wrote his De Materia Medica, and of course it is remarked in his renowned treatise, which title I've already mentioned. In discussing the boiling of milk for the purpose of separating the whey, he states that the procedure should be carried out in a new clay pot. Although he does not justify this recommendation, it may be inferred that the thermal processing was intended to take place in a vessel completely free from residues left by previously cooked foods. While the author does not specify the type of fuel to be used during this process, other medical sources, such as Galen's treatise entitled De Alimentorum Facultatibus, suggest that charcoal was employed as it allowed for relatively precise temperature control. To minimize the adhesion of milk to the inner surface of the previously unused pot and thus reduce the risk of caramelization, the contents of the vessels were to be stirred continuously with a freshly cut fig twig. This the twig naturally exuded a sap that acted as plant rennet, which intensified the coagulation process. It was for the sake of whey obtaining. Indeed, the narrative later reveals that the primary substances used for coagulation were a mixture of vinegar and honey, which was termed oxymely. The text also refers to the custom of placing a small silver vessel in the milk. The vessel was filled with just enough water to allow it float on the surface of the liquid. This practice was intended to prevent the milk from boiling over. The repeated mention of silver, however, of silver vessels, as the preferred material can also be significant, perhaps reflecting beliefs about its preservative or purifying properties. Lastly, it is worth noting a brief remark by Antimus, who wrote in 6th century, who advises against boiling milk in a bronze pot. Although the physician offers no explanation for the recommendation, it is plausible to assume that he attributed to bronze an detrimental effect on the properties of the acquired milk.
Some explanation from the perspective of modern science. The aforementioned recommendation regarding the boiling of milk in clay vessels appears entirely logical and well-founded, even if the absence of scientific validation, which remains scarce in the relevant scholarly literature. Stirring milk during heating ensures uniform temperature distribution throughout the liquid, which effectively prevents caramelization along the heated walls of the vessels. Boiling milk over charcoal required both experience and considerable care, depending on the type of wood used, the quantity of charcoal per session, and the thickness of the vessel walls. A range of temperatures could be achieved over varying periods of time. Thermal processing above 65 degrees results in the denaturation of most whey proteins, while B-lactoglobulin and alpha-lactoalbumin begins to denaturate at temperature above 74 degrees. When whey proteins are denaturated, they tend to aggregate or bind irreversibly to casein micella via disulfide bonds. This process leads to the formation of a surface film called lactoderma, which promotes the boiling over of milk. To prevent this, it's necessary to break the film, a task fulfilled by the placement of a small silver vessel filled with water. Silver is now recognized as a safe inorganic antimicrobial agent, effective against a wide range of pathogenic microorganisms. It is bactericidal at minimal concentration, exhibiting an oligodynamic effect through the release of toxic ions. As a result, silver is used for its antifungal and antibacterial properties. In contrast, vessels made of bronze, a copper and tin alloy, may give rise to several reactions. While these are generally not dangerous, they can affect the flavor of milk. Copper can react with acidic components in milk, such as organic acid, like lactic acid. The presence of copper ions catalyzes the oxidation of fatty acids, potentially resulting in unpleasant, bitter, metallic, or oxidized flavors and odors, and even a greenish discoloration of the product. Although such reactions are rare during standard boiling, they may occur with prolonged exposure or at elevated temperature. Bronze, especially if it contains a high proportion of copper, may also emit a metallic smell that alters the sensory characteristics of milk.
The second form of thermal processing mentioned in the sources involves the use of fire-heated pebbles, which were placed directly into vessels containing milk. The fact that the descriptions of this technique appear exclusively in medical texts suggests that it was employed to produce a substance that most closely conformed to the standards of ancient and medieval medical practice. From Galen's writings, we learn that he refined this method by replacing the stones with heated iron rings, which could be more easily inserted into or removed from the vessel using a metal rod. In his view, boiling milk with pebbles altered the properties of the resulting product, imparting mildly desiccative qualities to the milk curd. In contrast, the use of heated iron rings not only enhanced the drying effect, but also introduced astringent properties to the milk.
Modern research confirms that the use of heated iron rings could indeed alter the properties of milk. Lactoferrin, a protein naturally present in milk, has the ability to bind, that is, halide iron, which endows it with antimicrobial, anti-inflammatory, and immunomodulatory properties. The overall effect of milk processed in this manner could therefore have been interpreted as beneficial to health. However, It is also known that excessive heat can partially degrade lactoferrin, leading to a loss of some of its functional properties.
Medical sources appear at first glance to contain no explicit information regarding the duration required for effective thermal processing of milk. In reality, however, such information is indeed present, though it is primarily understandable for those with practical experience in the culinary preparation of milk. Myszkowska-Ryciak, for instance, refers to boiling the milk 2 or 3 times. Meanwhile, Rufus of Ephesus, as cited by Oribasius, recommends slow boiling over a low flame, hesyche kai epolygon, followed by gentle simmering, malakostehepsane, of the remaining portion in the vessel after some of the whey has evaporated, until the milk thickens evenly and acquires a sweeter taste. Accordingly, one can conclude that duration of thermal treatment was not standardized, as it would necessarily have depended on various factors, that is, on the specific qualities of the milk, the type of fuel used, of course the type of vessel, the equipment employed, and the intended therapeutic outcome of the process.
The reference to multiple rounds of milk boiling suggests that the process was conducted at a relatively low temperature, which would have required a fairly long duration. Based on contemporary data, it may be assumed that the thermal treatment of milk could have taken approximately 1 hour. This method appears to have produced a substance comparable to what we now know as condensed milk, from which a portion of the water has been removed. The resulting product was thickened with a more concentrated content of all nutrients, including lactose, which contributed to its sweet taste. Such a concentrated form of milk would have been more nutritious than milk in its natural state. Today, thermal processing of milk takes various forms. Technological advancement allows for precise control of temperature and duration, with these parameters significantly influencing the flavor profile. Ancient milk boiling can be compared to modern methods such as thermization in 55 to 65 degrees for up to 10 minutes, or pasteurization in 63 to 65 degrees for 30 minutes. From the perspective of contemporary consumers, higher pasteurization temperatures tend to correspond with lower sensory quality in terms of taste and aroma, although individual preferences play a role as well. Ancient medical texts describing increased viscosity and sweetness likely refer to milk that reached temperatures of up to approximately 70 degrees during boiling. Of course, temperature is a critical factor in the process, as it induces numerous changes in milk components and enhances their distinctive organoleptic properties. On the other hand, aroma, in particular, is perceived through the presence of alcohols, aldehydes, esters, ketones, and short-chain fatty acids.
Dietetic texts and materia medica also inform us that boiling was a method used both to extract the constituent parts of milk and to modify their properties. In this fashion, whey was obtained and employed in cleansing procedures, as the variety produced through natural fermentation was considered too sharp and thus too aggressive in its effects. This is likely what Ethias of Amida, writing in 6th century, had in mind when he advised against the use of whey derived from cheese production in medical treatments. By contrast, boiling milk, in accordance with the technological procedures described in the sources, allowed for the production of a high-quality whey, which was believed to possess the capacity to gently cleanse the digestive system.
Today, the type of whey primarily used in food processing and for consumption is so-called sweet whey, which is produced during the manufacture of rennet cheeses. In contrast, acidic whey, a byproduct of curd production, is used to a much lesser extent due to its low pH, lower than 5, and correspondingly a low consumer acceptability. It may be assumed that the recommendation to boil milk in order to obtain high-quality whey aimed at ensuring its microbiological purity by inhibiting the growth of pathogenic bacteria that could otherwise lead to infections and or poisoning.
In the context of the thermal processing of milk, dietitians also wrote about the extraction of milk curd. It was exactly the constituent that was attributed with milk's nutritional value, and its quantity in milk was additionally believed to influence the speed of digestion and excretion. In therapeutic practice, the curd was used in the treatment of dysentery.
The recommendation to subject milk to thermal processing in order to obtain milk curd can today be explained in terms of microbiological safety. The souring of milk involves the activity of lactic acid bacteria, whose metabolism leads to the production of lactic acids, as well as other compounds such as acetic acid, carbon dioxide, and ethanol. By producing lactic acid, these bacteria inhibit the growth of certain other microorganisms, which can be beneficial for preserving the product. However, this inhibitory effect does not extend to all pathogenic bacteria, some of which, such as Staphylococcus aureus and Escherichia coli, may proliferate alongside lactic acid bacteria. For this reason, milk destined for lactic acid fermentation is today first subjected to thermal treatment, which reduces microbiological risk.
So, the presented analysis of the sources clearly indicates that physicians of antiquity and Byzantium were able, through the thermal processing of milk, to obtain a valuable foodstuff and an effective therapeutic agent. The preserved testimonies demonstrate that every effort was made to ensure that the resulting product met the standards imposed by ancient and medieval materia medica. This entailed the selection of the highest quality milk for such procedures and the careful maintenance of optimal conditions during the boiling process. The examined sources suggest that one of the primary factors contributing to the deterioration of milk quality during heating was the presence of residual food particles adhering to the interior of a cooking vessel. In order to ensure the pot in which the milk was boiled was entirely free from contaminants, physicians emphasized the necessity of conducting this process in brand new vessels. The data also suggest that boiling milk with the aid of pebbles and metal rings enabled the production of a higher quality substance. Through thermal treatment, ancient physicians were able to modify the consistency of milk, thereby altering the proportions of its components and consequently its properties. They were also capable of isolating its individual constituents to obtain those with the desired characteristics. In this manner, they were able to produce a foodstuff, or rather a medicinal preparation, with therapeutic properties tailored to the specific requirements of the treatment.
Some appendix from nutritionist for the excellent auditory. In recent years, a new, in quotation, a new type of cow's milk has appeared on the market, which is usually referred to as A2A2 milk. It is characterized by the absence of the A1 variant of casein, a protein that constitutes approximately 30% of the casein content in cow's milk and is associated with adverse allergenic effect in humans. Interestingly, the A2 variant is naturally present in the milk of many mammals, including human, ghost, sheep, and certain cows, whereas the A1 variant appears only in cattle that have been selectively bred for increased milk production. At present, the genotyping of dairy cows allows for the targeted production of A2 milk, also referred to as primal milk, as it is presumed to possess properties similar to those of milk used in antiquity and the Byzantine period. Only through the analysis of such a product will it be possible to accurately verify ancient theories concerning the properties and therapeutic value of milk. Thank you.
And thank you very much for your attention.
So our next speaker is Chryssa Bourbou, and she's a bioarchaeologist at the Hellenic at the Ephorate of Antiquities, the Ministry of Culture, basically, where she's worked a lot on childhood, Roman history, but also Byzantine. So she's interested in health, basically, and feeding practices, and vitamin deficiency and nutrient deficiency in general. And she will be speaking about breathing life into Greek Byzantine populations. What would you ask a bioarchaeologist?
So, good evening to everyone. Thank you for being here. And I guess we all think of congresses as forums for transferring knowledge, but it is also, let's say, a place for meet again with friends and colleagues. So, thank a lot our organizers for putting together this congress and doing all this marvelous work so we can all be here together. As you just heard, my presentation will be about human bones. We smell the past, we will taste the past in the afternoon workshop. So let's see a little bit about the people behind all these things that constructed either antiquity or, in this case, the Byzantine period. When we usually think of the Byzantine body is what we know from documentary texts and artistic representations, and we think of the graceful bodies of the divine, the emaciated bodies of the ascetic, gold-sparkling bodies of the elite, and the powerful bodies of the clergy. So, where are the real people, in quotation mark, behind all this? I think the most fascinating things about bioarchaeology is that it gives this face to the past, independently if we are talking about the elite or the everyday people. And what has been successfully doing in the last years is that is bringing all this focus from the church and crown to the dirt and dust of the everyday life. As a discipline per se, bioarchaeology is very multi and interdisciplinary. So, especially for historic populations, when we study historic population, it will be a true pity if we don't take advantage of all this wealth of information that we can take from documentary evidence, artistic representation, the archaeological record, and all the finds that comes together in this specific spectrum. So again, we should consider bioarchaeology as the perfect nexus between biology and culture. I will focus this presentation to Byzantine bioarchaeology in the Greek context. Of course, there is a lot of work that has been done and continues to be done in different parts of Mediterranean and in the eastern part also during this specific period. But we don't have the time to analyze all this type of analysis of studies that have been made so far. So basically, nowadays we have studied more than 2,000 skeletons from Byzantine context in Greece. And this goes with an asterisk because, of course, we refer to a calculation that has to do with all these reports and papers that are published in scientific journals, proceedings, or specialized volumes on the topic. And some 300 of these skeletons have been also subjected to a specific analysis, and especially stable isotope analysis. So, what would you ask a bioarchaeologist? What I have been asked frequently is, for example, which factors enhance or buffer the development of specific pathological conditions. What did the Byzantine eat? Or can cultural diversity in this vast empire can be traced through the study of human bones? Were people engaged in strenuous and demanding lifestyles? What about the life of children? What do you know about their living conditions, their mortality patterns? Or how do traces on bones inform us of a lifetime of encounters with fellow humans and the environment? These are some of the questions that we are trying to answer during the last decades that we are working on Byzantine Greek population. So basically, we have diagnosed various kinds of diseases, and some of the most common that you can see here is dental pathologies and osteoarthritic lesions, common diseases from which we still suffer today. However, although they were common, doesn't mean that they were not painful. And sometimes more than we can imagine, because we didn't have, in certain circumstances, neither the measures, neither the remedies, or the pills to fight back against the symptoms or the pain that these conditions evoked. For example, the picture you see on the upper right is an impacted tooth, a canine tooth in the maxilla of an individual. This means that the tooth was trapped inside and never erupted, which this also caused some type of an abscess in the maxilla of this individual, and perhaps could have also contributed to the death of the individual. Fellow humans, sometimes we have a peaceful coexistence, sometimes not. And fractures, trauma in this case, give some insight to all these encounters. In the pictures that you see to your left, we have two skulls, and one of them is having this diagonal cut that you can see on the top, which was most probably made by a blade, kind of sword. So death was immediate for this individual, and the trauma on the bottom was of less severity, perhaps made from a small club. So it just produced a small bump in the skull of this individual. And in the other photo, you can see what we call in the bioarchaeological literature the common parifracture, which is a purely defending fracture that occurs in the ulna of our forearms. When somebody tries to give us a blow, we just do this kind of movement in order to defend ourselves. And of course, not all these traumatic injuries that we detect in the bioarchaeological record come from this type of violent episodes. They can also be due to everyday clumsiness, people fall down, or people performing their everyday activities. They can be very easily subjected to specific injuries. We also have invisible threats in the sense that in the last years there have been some scientific work focusing on infectious conditions like leprosy, which leaves very characteristic marks on the bones, or from paleoparasitological studies we can find this not that nicely coexistent between humans and parasites. Paleoparasitological analysis in its concept, it's simple because all you need is to take earth from different parts of the skeletons while you are excavating. So it is not a destructive method. You only collect the soil samples from the pelvic area, the skull and the feet to use as control. And then under the microscope, if you are lucky, you may have some indication, like in this case from Middle Byzantine Cemetery in Crete. We did this type of analysis, and we came across with the egg of the Ascaris, a round worm, which is the most big parasitic worm in humans and responsible for causing ascariasis. Another big issue and project is what brings together many different fields from biology, molecular studies like aDNA, bioarchaeology, funerary archaeology, environmental archaeology in a quest to see what happens and how spread what we call the first endemic, or also known as the Justinian plague. Another important indicator that we have through the study of bones is the physical presence of cultural diversity itself. We all know that the Byzantine Empire was a mosaic of culture and different populations. And in this case, we have the cranium that you can see on the picture, which is deformed in a sense, and was discovered in early Byzantine side of Maronia in the upper north area of Greece in Thrace. As you can understand, in this particular area, although Greece was considered as a crossroad for many populations that were crossing in the land, Thrace, being in the uppermost part of Greece, was very well known as this type of crossroad. This specific practice that we called artificial cranial deformation, because the cranium is since childhood, when the bones are still soft, undergoing some bandaging or any other type that can cause this shape in the skull. It's not a pathology, it's something that usually is done for specific culture as a very distinctive part of social status, for example. So this is a very well-known practice for different population at the time, like the Huns or the Avars, and perhaps these two women that were identified in the sample of Maronia in Greece most probably belonged to these specific groups. Another very interesting aspect of what bioarchaeology can do with the aid and contribution of specific chemical analysis, like the analysis of stable isotopes of carbon and nitrogen, is to identify the breastfeeding and weaning patterns of children in the Byzantine context and the dietary patterns of adults on the other hand. So this example that I will show you here is how we combine different information from different fields by starting with the examination of the children's bones and see what the isotopes say about this specific nursing and weaning patterns. We all know from the documentary evidence that breastfeeding was the ideal for the baby, because it would give all the necessary ingredients for a healthy development. Actually, also in the Byzantine biography, as you can see in this fresco, the woman who refuses to breastfeed her child was depicted among the sinners. So it is the woman you see here, and the snakes are biting her chest. So it would be really recommended to breastfeed the baby. When it comes to isotopes, the whole procedure, briefly explained, is that when you see the curve in A, this means that the baby is consuming breast milk in the sense of actually consuming the tissue of its mother. When the curve is coming down to B, It means that supplementary foods and preparation are added to the diet, and when the curve gets to C, this means that it's more or less close to the adult diet of the population. Usually we sample bones and teeth, and we project them against the mean values that we have for the adult female population in order to see exactly how this curve can appear. Again, documentary texts give us roughly an idea about when breastfeeding should stop, and it is about the age of 3 years. In some cases, we have some indication of a later weaning age around the age of 4. And they also note about the critical stage that weaning represents. These are specific passages in different medical writers that address this issue as weaning being a very important stage for the health of the young individual. So in the bars of the graph below, you see an example of the analysis of a Middle Byzantine cemetery, again from Crete, and as you can see, the peak is around the age between 2 and 5. Which more or less coincide with what the medical tests refer as the difficult period that follows weaning. And as you also can see with the graph to your right, this is exactly the results of the isotopic analysis, that roughly all the samples that have been checked give a weaning age between 3 and 4 years. Added to all this, that we have the documentary evidence and the isotopic evidence about the weaning age and the mortality of the specific non-adult population, we also had in this specific sample 4 cases of scurvy in this specific age category between 2 to 5 years old. Scurvy, as we all know, is the lack of vitamin C, and maybe these individuals have developed scurvy because the weaning food that they were introduced to them was basically made of cereals, and we all know that cereals lack of vitamin C. And these are preparations that usually are referred to all the medical texts that we know, how to wean the child or what type of food to give to a child, which is usually porridge made of cereals. And again, the same method of isotopes is also used for the reconstruction of the adult diet. Again, we have a stable isotope carbon and nitrogen, and what we can see is not a diary of diet, what this individual consumed before dying, but actually like what he or she have been consuming in some years before the death. Depending on the sampling, if we sample, for example, the rib, it's only a few years, but if we sample the femur, it could be over a decade. That can give us an idea about the food that this person has been consuming. And again, we are not going to say exactly what this person was consuming, but we have a broad categories of food products, either C3 plants like wheat or barley, either C4 plants like millet, either more protein intake that comes from animals or dairy products, or fish, either marine or fresh water. We can, from the data we have so far, to see a little bit of this Byzantine diet, in quotation mark again, which represents consumption of meat and cereals, but we all need to remember that food and the type of food consumed is always depending of manufacturers, and of course that the food is a cultural construction. So depending on many parameters, what we see in one site can slightly or largely differ from another side, either if it is a coastal side near the sea, and we are expected to see more marine consumption, but at the end we don't see, because it doesn't mean that islanders, because they live in an island, are consuming fish. They may be consuming more meat. And in specific other northern sites in Greece are giving this evidence of C4 plants, which is the holy grail in the interpretation of isotopic studies, because usually C4 plants, and especially millet, is always connected to famines and always considered as the diet of the poor. So this is something that we, I think, somehow reinterpret or maybe ask in a different way why we see the presence of millet. And I'm not going really to conclude. I'm just going to point out some challenges about the feature of bioarchaeology, not only for studying Byzantine population, but also as a scientific field. Definitely we need more data, definitely we need to do more comparison studies, and definitely we need to give more interdisciplinary studies. It's true that when I started working on Byzantine population, there was only a handful of publications related to the study of Byzantine people. And at that time, all these studies were usually the appendix of excavation reports, where someone, not all the times archaeologist in training, but usually physical anthropologist or biologist, was conducting the biological analysis of the remains with little or maybe not at all integration of cultural data or archaeological data. Today we have moved to a more nuanced analysis of these remains, but we still need to be this analysis more integrating different results and different data from various disciplines. I see it as not having each one its own chapter or its part in the chapter, but to sit down and work all together on how we can better interpret what really happened to these people during the Byzantine period. This is why I consider that we also need to pay special focus in more nuanced isotopic studies, because isotopic studies can also give specific information about not only diet, but also about pathological conditions. So we needed to re-examine or examine in a more detailed way all this information. And of course, when we are thinking about destructive techniques, to have a very good plan on how we are going to continuously sampling our skeletons, because here there is also an ethical dilemma on how we are treating this specific material. And to conclude, I think that the most important that we should need to do as a bioarchaeologist is to be the voice of the Byzantine people. And with this I mean to publicly presenting our results beyond the boundaries of the academic community, and leave a little bit our ivory tower that we are all closed in working on papers and presentation of conference, and give more of these results to our broader audience. Thank you.
Thank you very much to everyone. It was a brilliant session. I have a lot of questions, but I will open the floor to other people. So thank you very much to all the panelists. I think this was a very important panel to show us that it is so necessary to have these transdisciplinary methodologies and also these comparisons between historical studies, bioarchaeology, nutrition, and the modern sciences. And I think it is also very important what Effie and her colleagues do, especially clearing up the terminology we find in these ancient and Byzantine texts about this Oxos. I think it's very interesting because when I'm reading late Byzantine Dinamera or Zofia, I never found the term Targanon, so everything is Oxos. So this might be that also the Byzantine people confused it somehow, what it might be or might be behind. But I think it was very clear
that you've showed us, all of you, that we need these new technologies and methodologies to tackle the history, to tackle the science, and to understand our texts. I'm speaking as a philologist and Byzantinist, to understand these texts much more deeper and get on working with this. So I think, Chryssa, what you said in the end about we need much more transdisciplinary research, and we need especially these isotope things. Now I'm speaking for Byzantine medicine especially. I think you are absolutely right, and thank you, my warmest thanks to all of you for having shown that this is really absolutely important. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can I just say a comment on that? I think that part of the problem, or not the problem, but part of the thank you very much. But the issue is also to overtake our own biases. Exactly. It isn't just the text. It isn't just antiquity or the past. Personally, I couldn't get away that Oxos was vinegar. I could not, physically could not. I had all of the recipes in front of me. So it was a personal bias, the fact that they decided to follow my idea of what it should be, when the texts were telling me clearly that you should go sideways, not. So it isn't just, it's ourselves as well as the past.
Thank you for a super panel. I've got a comment for the Łódź Warsaw team and a question for Chryssa. The comment is, if Dioscorides was using a silver vessel to stop milk boiling over, he was not following the practice of most milk producers in the ancient Mediterranean. They didn't have silver. Just a comment. Then to Chryssa, it was claimed in 1999 that women in the ancient world were worse nourished than men, partly because of misunderstanding about pregnancy, when women were thought to have too much blood and therefore needed less nutrition, but also that women in general were worse nourished than men, less nourished than men. Could you comment on gender differences for nutrition in the bones you've looked at, please?
I can comment from the data we have so far. There are some indicators that could point, let's say, to not that good standard of living for the women. For example, if we take under consideration the mean age at death, women were dying between 30 to 35 years old in most Byzantine samples, as a mean, I mean, when males could live up to 45 years old, so 40 to 45 as a mean age. Very few exceptions of older individual. So this number, this age category for women as a mean, is also very frequently associated with pregnancy and the difficulties that the women at the time maybe had to focus when delivering a baby. So in terms of age, this is one type of fact. In terms of specific pathologies, in some cases, for example, we have different percentages of different diseases affecting differently male and female individuals. So, for example, if you have if you deal with injuries, male are suffering more injuries. If you deal with osteoarthritic changes, then this is a little bit more complicated because osteoarthritis goes, if of primary nature, goes with age, and it affects different joints depending on sex. So females, for example, they are more vulnerable for the knee joint, when males are more vulnerable for the hip joint, and the story goes on depending on the pathology we would like to investigate. And in terms of the efficiency for the isotopic data when it comes to nutrition and dietary patterns, we didn't really see any differences between males and females. So more or less they were consuming the same products. There is only one recent study from Thebes, from the cemetery of Agietriada, where some females in the analyzed samples are the only known so far individuals from Greek context that they were heavily depending on millet. One female in particular, it was estimated that 70% of her diet was based on millet. So the researchers need a little bit to perform more detailed studies like stable isotopes of strontium and oxygen in order to see, for example, migration patterns. Perhaps this individual came from a different region and a different dietary background. So I don't know if I answered the question, because it has to be a little bit more, let's say, specific for specific conditions or for specific parts of the investigation. But yes, bones can give some answers. Not every answer, and it depends on how we interpret the results, but some answers, yes, we can have.
Thank you very much. Wonderful.
Yeah, there are so many things I would want to comment on in that session and to ask about, but I do just want to say to Effie, I'm humbled to know that my translation was useful at the beginning of that series of experiments. But I'm aware that Fortuna has something to do with this, the goddess Fortuna, because a translator can very easily make a wrong choice and conceal something from you. Don't ever trust a translator, really.
I think that these papers are wonderful. They are absolutely great. They are examples of, you could basically make a film of them and show them to students, this is how it is to be done. That said, I have a question about the risk of reducing the historic experience to the concepts of modern science. And this is something I think about quite a lot in my own research, where you have a historical phenomenon, and then you choose, which I also do, so don't take this as kind of a critique shooting your wonderful research. When you take this historical experience and the terms of the historical actors, and then you translate them into modern scientific concepts using the words, the terminology of chemistry and of mineralogy and so forth, and kind of explaining their work and actions in modern terms. And this, of course, is absolutely necessary, but it also bears its own special risk of reducing the experience to our experience, and therefore silencing the other aspects of their culture. So I'm thinking if you could elaborate on how you think about these aspects in relationship to the kind of research that you are doing. Thank you.
Yeah, I start a short answer. I think the complete reconstruction of the food, the smells, and the plant and animal and foodstuffs is impossible today. We, in the ancient time, we have a completely other environment, other pollution, other composition of plant and meat and milk, and of course we can use some information to translate and to explain today for on the basis or on our knowledge, but it's not fully possible to reconstruct some things, some products, and some, I don't know what else, but it's of course, we can use the information and we can explain it, but the reconstruction is impossible. It's my
just before, Effie. Nevertheless, we should start to. We should try to work out something like a rough image. Given those people who were as intellectual or able just to think, as we do, probably they did for the same reasons. Sometimes they could differ, as. Sometimes we do not understand what they meant, just like Effie proved, yeah? But basically, general patterns, okay, but Oxos, this is an exception to the rule. So, you proved that there is one term we didn't understand properly, but what about the rest? So now we have to work for years and years and go through everything and then summarize this and find out what percentage was right and what percentage was modified. I'm not sure whether this is an answer to your question, but this is sort of commentary on it. Thank you.
It was a very good question, what you asked, and we do have something in common, and that is the field. And I came to the world of wine and vinegar making completely out of the blue. I had absolutely no experience at all. But I wanted to start at the field level and the pot with the must in it. I think we have forgotten a bit to trust our senses in this. We have such a plethora of analytical techniques. They're coming out of our ears. We can rely at the drop of a hat at any information. We can get access to analysis at the drop of a hat. What we don't build, and this is what we're missing, I think, is this appreciation of the world via our senses. And to trust them too, not to give the definitive answer necessarily, but to begin to see that world via the senses, because that's what we share. We don't share analytical techniques with antiquity or results in tabular form. We share sensory experiences with them and observations. So unless you do something in the field yourself, you can't even begin to appreciate, not in a good or a bad sense. You can't begin to talk the language. It's as simple as that. If you don't make cheese yourself, even if it's once, it doesn't matter. You don't have to become a cheese maker or an Oxos maker or a vinegar maker. But all you have to do is just wet your hands in the process, because your senses are going to come in and instantly navigate you, even if you know nothing about it. And then you've touched base with antiquity. You have something in common. And for me, it was, as I said, a real experience, this, because I would go into the hut and the smells would come out, and the liquid would not look very good, or it doesn't matter my appreciation of it. It is that the senses were working full time. And then I have my analytical techniques and the techniques of all my colleagues to tell me everything I want. But first, I got my senses to work.
Thank you very much. So first of all, I'm really thrilled. I really enjoyed all the presentation, and maybe I'll try to pick up the trace that Joanna started. I also had an impression that and it was also said about the translation. I had an impression that we should not fall under the kind of atmosphere that we know everything. In a while we'll try to show you our efforts in reconstructing Tyriac, but like was said, you should never trust the translator, you should never trust the reconstructors, because our senses also are often misleading, and we might get the impression that we are doing something right because this is how our culture does it, and they might have a different experience on that. And very often we think we found something, and then we realize, well, we are pretty sure about it, and after a year or two someone says, well, no, it's not like this, it could be a different thing, and we were quite certain about it. So there are things that I think we should always keep in mind, like with the translations, that this is just what our impression after doing a reconstruction is. And there are two factors that I wanted to add. Again, not diminishing and not kind of criticizing, because all the efforts that we also made quite a lot of mistakes, and someone told us, well, that's not like you thought it is. But there are two things that I wanted to do, like the two things that I maybe witnessed. And when we have the scientific explanation, for example, when it goes to the pot, that we should not use the one made from copper or one made from bronze, or probably if they had one made of steel as well, because there might be some chemical reaction. Yes, of course, this is one of the possible explanations, but also if you put a thin copper or bronze pot on a very hot charcoal, then you have a very high temperature and a very fast diffusion of the temperature in just few spots, and the milk will get burned in few spots and will not get heated up in a very homogeneous way. So using a clay pot will reduce the possibility of burning in few places. So it also might be an argument for using not a metal vessel but a clay vessel. Again, I'm not saying that your explanation is bad. I'm just saying that maybe there are more factors in it. And the second thing that I came up, that they wanted to boil the milk for, like you said, 1 hour or something. I don't know about the milk, but I remember from Galen and from 16th century guidebooks that to make the water drinkable, they did boil it, but they didn't just want to get rid of the bacteria. Obviously, they didn't know about it. They wanted to get rid of the bad humours and the miasmas. So the good way of boiling water to make it drinkable was to evaporate like 30% of it. So after evaporating 30% of the pot that you had, it was drinkable. They would consider that now it's fine. Not because we killed bacteria, because we got rid of the bad miasma and bad humus. So maybe condensating the milk was obviously making it more nutritious. But at the beginning of the process, they didn't want to make it nutritious, just they wanted to get rid of the bad humus or whatever they wanted, they didn't want in that. So that's again a thought that doesn't at no point cancel or deny any of your explanations, but it's another possibility that we might take under consideration. So basically I wanted to say that we should discuss, because there are always some new ideas on the market, and but I'm really thrilled. Great job, thank you.
Can I say something, although it's not a question for my talk. I think that as long as we are very honest with ourselves and very humble with our results, it's okay. Because of course we don't know everything, of course we cannot present everything, of course we cannot publish everything, and we just present some of our initial or preliminary or some type of results. So yeah, discussion is very good, and I think this is why we are here. because we can exchange different opinions, different point of view, things that perhaps one missed, somebody else see. So I think in all these efforts to mingle a little bit the modern practice with the old practice is just another way to go a little bit closer to the past. This is what we want to know, and in a way to interpret, even if we use it in the modern way, even if we are very biased and we have a very Western perspective on how to interpret things. It's our effort. This is how I feel it.
No, you're absolutely correct, but there's no but. You're absolutely correct. But I think that until we begin to have an understanding of what empirical practice was all about, we can't really begin to touch antiquity or the past. This ability to observe and deduce from your observations whether note, connect, cause and effect. These are all experiences and things that the human mind does. If you are observant, if you're interested in what you're doing. We don't observe enough, I think, our world, because we're not out in the world. We're just behind our computers screens and our offices, and our education isn't aimed to allow the little ones to observe for themselves first, before they can formulate the views. Everything is presented to them, and so it's very difficult for us to reach that world because of just that particular aspect of it. If I'm allowed to something say in public, it's in honor of my father. He was a cheesemonger, and my earliest experience in life was to be at the cheese factory. And the smells were, of course, everything there. I was 4 years old, my earliest experience, as I said. And all I remember him doing is walking around the big vats that were being churned with the milk in it that the shepherds had brought in. And all he had as an apparatus was a thermometer, which I had in my office, a wooden thermometer, and nothing else. And the most exquisite feta cheese that Greece ever made came out of that factory. So I can't access even my father's empirical practice. That's all I can say, because I have no experience of it, and it isn't in cheese making, in anything else. So until we begin to think in terms of that aspect, again, I can't see how we can reach antiquity, and it isn't romantic, it's real.
I'd just like to register a very strong protest against Andrew Dolby and the last questioner. Andrew said you should never trust a translator, even though people have been using his Geoponica to very good effect. And the last questioner said that translations were a big problem. My simple point is, if you don't translate things, most people don't read them. That's not just people who don't know ancient Greek. People who do know ancient Greek normally only read Galen in translation and with the TLG. And Manuela Marai knows this very well. People don't normally read compound medicines in detail. They use the TLG. And so whatever the faults of translators might be, of course, they are human and they make mistakes. If you don't have translations, most people don't read it. That is my strong protest.
A comment for Chryssa. Thank you so much. It was such a great paper about the female skeleton, and she mostly ate millet. So I've been wondering whether that could have been for the management or treatment of a disease. So, for instance, celiac or an allergy, a food allergy.
Okay.
Or alternatively, as a treatment for hyperthyroidism. And as a footnote, I need to check this. I don't have the details here, but from memory, there was a criminal case some decades ago where it's one of those women who are found dead, who can't be identified. And I remember that she lived on a diet of millet almost exclusively, and the isotope analysis placed her in southern East Poland.
Okay.
And she then moved house, and I might be wrong about this, but from memory, somewhere on the Italian side of the Alps.
Okay.
And was ultimately found dead in Germany. So they had, they had on TV this whole case that what kind of minority population would largely eat a millet-based diet, and why would a person do this? I'll find it.
Okay.
I hope I'm not wrong about
I will
this.
pass the information to the colleague who did the analysis. But as I said, I would appreciate a study on millet like the one Adam did for barley. Adam, will you do one? Because although we have briefly discussed it, and millet doesn't really appear so much in the documentary evidence, at least for the Byzantine period, or it's sporadic, the appearance. But it would be really interesting to know more about this, because we have all this perception that millet is the inferior food, is the food of the poor, usually eaten in times of famine or other crises. But as I said, I think food is a cultural thing. So millet, as we know today, is one of the most resilient crops. And actually, taking in account what is going on with the climate crisis, there are many countries worldwide that they would like to turn their stable crops to millet, because millet can really survive in the most adverse situations. So I would like to think past populations as also very resilient and clever people, and not only consuming millet because they didn't have anything else, So it will be interesting, because in studies from medieval Europe, when they come across individuals consuming millet, there is indeed something strange happening with them. So, in terms of being immigrants to the place where they were buried, from a different origin and stuff like that. So if you have this information, I will pass to the colleague. It will be nice to have. Thanks.
I wouldn't ever argue for a moment with John Wilkins. But I would just say, I didn't say don't ever read a translation. I said don't ever trust a translation. And the smaller detail that you're relying on, the less safe it is to trust the translation. And I go beyond. A translator is one of the screens between you and what the author thought. And of course, the first of those screens is would be the autograph, the author's manuscript, which we very rarely have. The second screen then is the surviving manuscript. And if Deals and Tued do their work properly, we can get to those surviving manuscripts very often. And more and more often, they are online. We can read them online even. And then the next screen is the editor. And there could be two editors who have completely different thoughts about a particular text or a particular bit of text. You have to go beyond the editors if you can And you certainly do have to go beyond the translator, especially for specific details. But we're all doing what we can in the best way we can. Read translations, yes.
Well, I have a lot of questions, but I would bother every one of you during lunch break. So thank you again. Thank you all for the session. It was brilliant.